I moved to the edge of Stonebrook for a reason. After 32 years serving as a military engineer, 6 tours, 3 continents, and too many landslides, and levee failures to count, I was tired. Not just in body, but in spirit. I wanted quiet trees, water, and space where no one was shouting orders or making noise just to be heard. So when I found a narrow slice of land that backed up against a winding creek just outside the main rows of identical cul-de-sacs, I knew it was home. The creek wasn't anything majestic. It wasn't a roaring river or some legendary stretch of wilderness. It was simple, narrow in most places, shaded by willows and old elms, and in the summer it trickled softly like a whisper through tall reeds. It was the kind of water you could sit beside with a thermos of coffee and not say a word for hours. The back third of my land sloped gently toward that creek. Over the years, I cleared a modest path down to it, built a bench from salvaged cedar, and planted native shrubs that would prevent erosion. I didn't build a fence not because I was careless, but because I believed in natural boundaries. Besides, everyone who knew anything about the area knew that creekfront belonged to my parcel. HOA lines ended 2 properties before mine. At least they were supposed to. For the first 2 years, no one bothered me. The HOA meetings were a faraway murmur, mostly centered around lawn-length mailbox colors and Easter flags. I kept to myself, paid the minimum dues required, because technically my home sat within the broader Stonebrook boundaries, and I politely declined to attend anything resembling a social gathering. People respected that, until they didn't. It started with children, maybe 4 or 5 of them, some on bikes, some just wandering in the pairs started cutting through the tree line at the edge of my backyard. I didn't mind at first. They weren't harming anything. Kids are curious. They'd follow the creek, throw stones, laugh, and race each other until dusk, then disappear up the hill. But by late spring, it wasn't just children anymore. I found footprints, adult-sized. And one morning, a crude wooden stake with orange tape marked into the soil just 20 feet from my bench. I thought it might be a utility marker at first, called the city. They had no record of any planned work. Then I noticed more stakes, bright orange, fanning out in a crude rectangle along the creek bank. No labels. No explanation. Just quiet, ominous symbols of something coming. When I asked my neighbor, Dale, if he'd heard anything, he looked sheepish. HOA's been talking about building a little summer camp spot for the kids, he said, scratching the back of his neck. I think they wanted to set up a fire ring, some picnic benches. Give the families something to do. On my land, I asked. He looked away. They said it was common use. Said the lines weren't real clear down there. That was the moment I felt it, that deep churn in my gut, the one I used to feel before we lost a hillside to bad intel and wet soil. I went home and pulled my deed. The boundary line was crystal clear. The creek was mine. Not HOA property, not common greenbelt, not forgotten no man's land. Mine. I drafted an email to the HOA office, attaching photos of the markers, the coordinates, and the boundary diagram from my deed. I expected a quick retraction, an apology, maybe even a thank you for catching the error before they embarrassed themselves. Instead, I got silence. And then a week later, the machines came. I woke at 7:12 a.m. to the rattling growl of a rented backhoe and the high-pitched whine of a power auger. I threw on boots and a jacket and stomped down the hill, heart pounding. There in the early morning mist were 3 men in safety vests unloading lumber. A small portable toilet sat near the path, and someone had already dug out a square pit where my bench had once been. My bench was gone, I shouted. The men looked up, one shrugged and said, "We've got clearance from the HOA. You're on my land," I barked. "This isn't community property. This is private." A woman stepped forward from behind a stack of 2x6s, blonde, sharply dressed, despite the mud clipboard in hand. "Sir," she said coolly, "this area was designated as a youth recreation site by the board. Please refer all questions to President Watch Carson." "Carson," I muttered. "Ela Carson." She didn't answer, just pointed toward the clipboard. "We've got approval. If you touch the equipment, it'll be considered obstruction." I felt my hands tighten, but I took a breath. Old habits. Never escalate. Document. So I took pictures. Of the machinery, the workers, the destroyed shrubs, the crushed stream bank, and the pile of refuse someone had dumped under the willows. I photographed the orange tape, the tire tracks, the toilet, the hole where my bench used to be. Then I turned and walked away, slowly, because I knew this wasn't just disrespect. It was trespass. and I'd spent 3 decades learning exactly how to handle threats like this. But I'd play it their way, for now. By the next morning, they had framed out a small pavilion, just a simple square of pressure-treated lumber on cinder blocks. But the message was loud and clear: they weren't going anywhere. It was astonishing how quickly something illegal could start to feel official when people acted like they had the right. I walked the perimeter, hands behind my back, the same way I used to inspect unstable bunkers in Afghanistan. Even then, I could tell they had no erosion plan, no permits, no awareness of where the floodplain began or how the creek could rise 6 feet in a flash storm. There was a stack of lumber leaning against a tree on my side of the property line, untarped. That alone would be enough to invite rot and termites. But the real problem was the filled dirt. They had begun to level the uneven ground by shoveling soil and gravel into low spots, completely ignoring the fact that this area had always acted like a sponge during the rainy season. I knelt beside a patch of compacted earth, ran my fingers over it, and felt it. The land was no longer breathing. I drove straight to the county planning office that afternoon with my survey plat deed and about 24 photographs on a USB drive. The receptionist, a kind woman named Joanne, told me the HOA had submitted no permits, no requests, and had not contacted any hydrologist or structural review team. She referred me to a field inspector, but warned that the waiting list was long. They usually prioritize bigger developments, she explained. Apartment buildings, hospitals, that sort of thing. But if it's near a creek and it's affecting drainage, that might speed things up. It's affecting more than drainage, I said. They're compromising flood safety, and they're doing it on someone else's land. She gave me a look that told me she believed me, but she'd seen things like this before. HOAs that thought they were untouchable. Committees that acted like they were above the law, especially when no one fought back. I left her office with a formal complaint form in hand, which I submitted that evening. By Friday, the pavilion had a roof. They had even strung up fairy lights and stacked plastic Adirondack chairs under the overhang. A volunteer sign-up sheet was tacked to a post, inviting residents to join our Summer Creek Camp Build Day. I watched from my back deck, arms crossed, a mug of black coffee cooling in my grip. There was a kind of smugness in how they worked, a suburban confidence that rules didn't matter if enough people acted like they didn't exist. That afternoon, I received an envelope shoved into my mailbox without a stamp. Inside was a printed notice on Stonebrook HOA letterhead. Dear Mr. Garrison, our records indicate that the parcel adjacent to the creek common zone may overlap with your privately held land. As community usage of this area has been ongoing and in accordance with Stonebrook Covenant 5.3c, any attempt to obstruct improvements intended for the benefit of the neighborhood may result in civil penalty. Kindly refrain from interfering with construction and direct all questions to the HOA Executive Board. Sincerely, Lila Carson, HOA President. It was laughable. First, there was no such thing as a creek common zone, not in the deed, not on the original HOA charter. And second, Covenant 5.3c applied only to structures that were pre-approved and zoned for shared access, neither of which applied here. I printed out the letter and added it to a growing folder I'd labeled HOA Violations, Creek Encroachment. I included photos from that day, teenagers dragging branches into a fire ring made from concrete pavers, children climbing on stacked logs like a jungle gym. Then I began digging deeper. If they wanted to escalate, they'd get escalation. I requested a GIS overlay from the Ogg County Clerk's office. When the map came through 2 days later, it confirmed what I already knew. The so-called Creek Camp was built squarely on my property, well within the protected riparian buffer zone, an environmental designation that made the unauthorized construction not only a zoning violation, but also a possible violation of the Clean Water Act. They had no idea what they'd stepped in, and worse, they didn't care. I tried one more time. I walked down to the site the following Saturday morning when a small crowd of parents had gathered for a community cookout beside the unfinished deck. I didn't bring any threats, just a copy of the survey map and my deed. Lila Carson stood near the grill in her signature wide-brimmed sun hat, a clipboard in one hand and a sparkling water in the other. She was smiling and handing out name tags, looking every inch the self-appointed queen of Stonebrook. I approached her calmly and said, "We need to talk. This is your last chance to de-escalate." She didn't even look at the papers I offered, just sipped her drink and said, "We have legal counsel, Mr. Garrison. I suggest you do the same if you're going to start throwing threats around." "It's not a threat," I replied. "It's a floodplain. And if one of these kids gets hurt out here, you won't be hiding behind a committee. You'll be liable." The air got cold between us. One of the other board members, a balding man in a Stonebrook t-shirt, chimed in. "We've had our real estate attorney look at the boundaries. It's ambiguous." "No, it's not," I said, handing him the map anyway. "This is from the county GIS department. The creek, the trees, and everything 10 feet past that post over there, all mine." "You can't stop us," Lila said, her voice sugary but tight. "The community supports this. You're just one voice." "That's all it takes when it's the truth," I said, and walked away. That night, I submitted a second formal complaint. This time, I attached the GIS overlay deed documentation and photographs showing the fire ring in use within 50 feet of a navigable waterway. On Monday, I got a call. "Mr. Garrison," said the voice on the other end. "This is Trent Walters from the County Environmental Compliance Office. I received your materials and, yeah, this is bad. Do you mind if we schedule a site visit?" "Not at all," I said. "In fact, I insist." "Good," he said, "because I think the HOA just picked a fight they can't win." 3 days after that call, I stood beside a county-issued truck as Trent Walters and his assistant, Carla, reviewed the GIS overlay against the site in person. Trent was in his 40s, lean and sharp-eyed, dressed in khakis and hiking boots with a laser measure hanging from his belt. Carla was younger, but just as precise. She didn't say much, just took constant notes on a clipboard as they walked the perimeter with me. "They didn't even install silt fencing," Trent muttered, crouching beside the edge of the creek where the ground had been gouged and filled. "No runoff control, no vegetation buffer. This is a violation sandwich." Carla snorted, but didn't look up. She was already marking coordinates on a form labeled Emergency Response Riparian Zone Violation. We walked past the pavilion, which now had a crude plastic roof tarp flapping in the wind. Someone had painted a sign on a wooden board that read, "Creek Camp Zone, Future Generations Welcome." Trent squinted at it. "Did they get a name registered for this?" "Nope," I said. "They built it fast and loud, but they didn't bother with a single public record." He looked around. "And you're saying this entire stretch," he gestured from the fire ring to the edge of the platform, "is your deeded property?" "Here's the survey," I said, handing it to him again, even though he'd already received it digitally. Lot 47. Goes all the way to the southern bank. They're 18 feet over. Trent stared at the lines, then nodded slowly. "We'll file this as a Category 2 encroachment with high-risk ecological impact. That fire ring especially, it's within a protected water corridor. These idiots are playing with matches on a powder keg. And kids have been playing here unsupervised," I added. "I've seen them climbing half-nailed structures. If someone gets hurt, they'd be liable. Personally, not just corporately." His voice turned serious. "You said the HOA president is Lila Carson," I said, suppressing the urge to spit just at the mention. "She's been stonewalling me for weeks." Carla looked up for the first time. "She the one who submitted that fake property map?" I smiled grimly. "I'm glad you saw that." By mid-afternoon, Trent had his photos, measurements, and environmental notations. As they packed up, he said, "We'll fast-track this through compliance. Could take a week or two before formal notice, but if we get rain soon." "It's coming," I said, glancing up at the heavy clouds lingering far on the horizon. "This time of year, it always is." As they drove off, I felt a strange combination of tension and validation. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't just being territorial or difficult. The experts saw what I saw. What I had known from the start. That land was fragile. That land was mine. And the HOA had crossed a line they couldn't erase with community potlucks and pretty speeches. 2 days later, Lila showed up at my front door. It was just after 6 p.m. The sky was the color of old bruises, thick with the promise of rain. I hadn't even had time to sit down with dinner when I heard the knock, sharp, urgent, and too familiar. I opened the door, and there she was, holding a manila envelope and wearing a blazer like she'd just come from an HOA summit. "Mr. Garrison," she said stiffly. "Lila, I'd like to speak." "You are speaking," I replied. And this is private property, so I'd recommend choosing your next sentence carefully. She gave me that tight, practiced smile. We'd like to resolve this without escalating things unnecessarily. I laughed. I couldn't help it. Oh, you want to de-escalate now? After you built a fire pit over a water corridor and sent me a fake covenant letter, that letter was reviewed by our legal liaison. No, it wasn't, I interrupted, because I checked. And the attorney you referenced, he hasn't worked with your board in 2 years. He disavowed any knowledge of your activities. She faltered just a second, but I saw it. We understand you've made a complaint to the county, she continued. But that only creates hostility. We want a spirit of cooperation in the neighborhood. I stared at her. You've been trespassing on protected land. You destroyed my bench. You dug without permits. And you lied about property boundaries. She offered the envelope. We're willing to redraw the map, share the area, as dual-use space, maybe rotate access during the week, just to show we're flexible. I didn't take it. Flexible doesn't fix erosion. And I'm not interested in sharing land that was mine to begin with. Her lips pressed into a thin, colorless line. You realize this makes you look unreasonable, right? The community wants this. No, I said softly. You want it. The rest of them, they're just following your noise. I stepped back, about to close the door, when she raised her voice. If you keep pushing this, you'll regret it. People here can make things very inconvenient. There it was. The threat. The HOA in full bloom. I didn't respond. Just shut the door in her face. I heard the envelope drop to the porch as she left. The next morning, I found my mailbox, open mail scattered across the lawn. The side of my fence near the creek had been kicked in, and someone had scratched the words "selfish old man" into the wooden slats. That was it. I called Trent, then filed a police report. Not because I expected justice from the local sheriff. Stonebrook's HOA donated generously to local events, and I wasn't naive, but because I was drawing a line. If they wanted a fight, they'd get one. But not on their terms. I printed 10 more copies of my deed, laminated them, and posted one every 20 feet, along the creek line, anchored in the soil with steel stakes. Each one read, Private property, Lot 47. No trespassing. Riparian buffer zone. Protected under County Code 78.1402. Let them try to tear those down. I had more, and the rain was coming. By the time the first heavy rain hit, the so-called creek camp had expanded into something that looked like a third-rate park built by amateurs. There was a rope swing tied haphazardly to an old elm that leaned over the water like a tired sentinel, a ring of mismatched lawn chairs sinking into soft earth, and even a plywood kiosk nailed to 2 fence posts bearing a hand-painted sign that read, Stonebrook Youth Zone, sponsored by HOA. They had made it official. Or so they believed. And at the center of it all stood Lila Carson Blonde Helmet, of hair waterproof windbreaker, zipped to her chin, clipboard in hand like it was a scepter. She strutted from one makeshift structure to another, issuing orders with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in her entire life. I watched her from my kitchen window, mug of tea in hand, every muscle in my jaw clenched tight. The arrogance wasn't just insulting, it was dangerous. The pavilion had been reinforced with support beams that dug directly into the root systems of native shrubs. They'd moved rocks from the stream bank to build a makeshift amphitheater. Someone had even laid PVC piping under the soil to divert muddy areas, which meant they were rerouting the natural flow of stormwater without understanding where it would go. If they'd asked, I could have told them. The answer was everywhere. The following weekend, they hosted what Lila proudly referred to in an email blast as Family Field Day. I wasn't on the HOA mailing list, but a concerned neighbor named Donna slipped a copy into my mailbox with a handwritten note at the top. You need to see this. Beneath the cheery fonts and Canva clip art were plans for outdoor games, potluck BBQ, and creekside exploration for the kids. I wanted to scream. That morning, my property was crawling with people. Children shrieked as they waded into the creek barefoot. Parents tossed beanbags over my posted boundary signs. And Lila herself stood with a microphone giving speeches about taking back nature and making space for young hearts to grow. No one noticed me at first. Not until I stepped forward down the path I'd carved years ago with my own hands and raised a portable megaphone. Attention, I said calmly but firmly, the same tone I'd used when leading platoons through mine-ridden terrain. This is private land. You are trespassing. You need to vacate the area immediately. The music stopped. Heads turned. Lila caught mid-toast with a plastic cup, lowered it slowly. "Mr. Garrison," she said sweetly, her voice pitched just above condescending, "you're disrupting a permitted community event." "There is no permit," I replied louder now. "There is no legal basis for this construction, for this gathering, or for the damage you're doing to the creek and to this land." A few people began to move away awkwardly, unsure of whether this was part of the show. Others whispered. Children paused confused. Lila didn't move. "I'd advise you to leave before someone calls the sheriff." I stepped onto the platform, my platform by all legal accounts, and held up the laminated county map. "This is a legal copy from the GIS department," I announced. "The creek and everything within 25 feet of its banks is part of Lot 47. That's my land. This site is also located within a federally protected riparian buffer zone. You are violating state, county, and federal regulations." Someone in the crowd muttered. A man with a Stonebrook hoodie said, "Wait, I thought this was HOA land." "HOA land ends 30 feet back," I said, pointing behind me. "What you've built here is unauthorized and hazardous." Lila's smile fractured. "You're making a scene." "No," I said, stepping down from the platform. "You made a mistake. And now you're panicking." That was the moment she snapped. "I don't know who you think you are," she hissed, storming toward me. "You're one man. You can't stop progress. The community stands behind this. You're just some old guy, squatting on land that should have been used for good." I held her gaze. "I spent 30 years studying land like this. I've seen what happens when people ignore water slope and science. And I'm not letting your ego be the reason a child drowns when the bank gives way." For the first time, she had no answer. I turned and walked away. By that evening, the skies opened. Thunder rolled through the hills like cannon fire, and rain came in sheets so thick I couldn't see my fence line from the porch. I stood there in my raincoat, arms crossed, listening to the pounding of water against soil, the rising rush of the creek, unpredictable, unyielding, just like I remembered. And then, around midnight, I heard the unmistakable groan of shifting timber. The next morning, I found it half collapsed. The pavilion's southern supports had sunk into the waterlogged ground, tilting the whole structure forward. Mud had caked over the fire pit, and the lawn chairs were scattered like driftwood. A yellow plastic slide lay overturned halfway down the embankment. I didn't smile. It wasn't victory, not yet, because even now Lila wasn't done. The very next afternoon, she held a press conference. Yes, a full-blown press conference. She stood at the edge of the destruction, surrounded by 2 HOA board members and a reporter from the Old Stonebrook Sentinel, painting the storm as an act of nature that had tragically wiped out a beloved community project, calling on residents to rally behind the reconstruction. She used phrases like resilience and shared dreams, and even dared to blame the damage on land instability from years of disrepair. She never said my name, but everyone knew. It was a PR war, and I was the villain in her little story. I needed reinforcements, not just from the county, from the truth. That night, I wrote a statement backed with documentation timelines and expert references, and submitted it not only to the Sentinel, but to the county's Environmental Review Board, the Regional Watershed Commission, and 2 neighborhood Facebook groups I'd never posted in before. The headline I used was simple: HOA built an illegal camp on protected creekland. The storm just proved why that matters. And I included photos of the crushed native shrubs, the mangled pavilion, the blocked water line, and yes, the county's official map with my name on the deed. It started to spread. By morning, I had messages in my inbox, some from neighbors apologizing for not knowing, some from strangers asking if this was a common issue with HOAs, and one from a woman named Mariah Jenkins, an investigative journalist from the city. She wanted to talk. And for the first time since this battle started, I felt the tide turning. Maria Jenkins showed up with a notepad, a recorder, and a no-nonsense attitude sharpened by years of covering zoning scandals and environmental negligence. She was polite but direct, and within 10 minutes of our conversation, I could tell she wasn't just looking for neighborhood drama. She was after a pattern, a system, abuse hidden under the polite facade of planned communities. We sat under the covered portion of my back deck, sipping strong coffee, as the creek murmured just beyond the tree line. The wreckage from the creek camp still lay there raw and slanted, a physical scar carved into living land. From here, you could see where the soil had split beneath the platform, and the exposed roots of a dogwood tree desperately clinging to the eroded edge. Maria clicked on her recorder. So in your words, walk me through what happened, from the beginning. I told her everything. The orange flags, the fake covenant letter, the destroyed bench, the threats, the vandalism, the refusal to acknowledge property lines or environmental protections. I gave her the documents, my deed, the county GIS overlay, even copies of the emails from Lila Carson. But what really caught her attention were the photos I'd taken of the kids running through the camp unsupervised, barefoot, with fire pits smoldering beside them. You said they rerouted the soil drainage, she asked. They dug small trenches and tried to redirect runoff from the low spots under the pavilion. Problem is, that moved the flow downstream faster, more concentrated. It undercut the southern bank. That's what caused the collapse, part of it. But the real problem is this land was designed to flood. It absorbs water like a sponge when left untouched. You compact the soil, you build on top of it without stabilization, and it doesn't just collapse, it surges. Maria looked out toward the creek. How long do you think until this becomes more than just a neighborhood issue? I glanced at the thick clouds still dragging their shadows over the hilltops. That depends on how soon they try to rebuild. Within 48 hours, her article dropped. HOA versus the watershed. One man's fight to stop an illegal creekside build. It was sharp, factual, and damning. She quoted county officials, anonymously included my GIS maps and deed images, and referenced the environmental regulations violated by the HOA's construction. She even mentioned the damage to native plant species and the potential legal implications of rerouting stormwater without a permit. The response was immediate. Some neighbors were furious, mostly the ones who had backed Lila. I overheard one man at the grocery store mutter something about the guy who hates kids when I passed by. But others, the quieter ones, started emailing me. One neighbor named Edgar, a retired biology teacher, reached out to say he'd noticed birds disappearing from the creek line since the build began. A woman named Teresa said she'd filed a complaint herself after seeing rodent droppings near her garden for the first time in years. And then came the real blow. Trent Walters from the county showed up again, this time with backup 3 members of the HOA Environmental Enforcement Division and a woman from the each regional watershed board. They weren't here for a conversation. They were here for documentation. Mr. Garrison, Trent said, shaking my hand, we've completed our internal assessment. The site qualifies for emergency hazard designation under both the Pot County's Environmental Safety Code and the state's Urban Watershed Protection Act. I nodded. That sounds serious. It is. He gestured toward the creek. This entire area is now designated as a protected buffer, effective immediately. The structure will be condemned, and anyone attempting to use or reconstruct it will be in violation of county law. We're placing signage today. Carla handed me a packet of forms. Inside were copies of the official hazard declaration, a list of fines assessed to the Stonebrook HOA, and an order of immediate cessation for all activity on the site. Then she handed me something else, a certificate of commendation. For bringing this to our attention before someone got seriously hurt, she said. I didn't say much, just nodded, because deep down I knew this wasn't over, not with Lila. The signs went up that afternoon. Hazard zone, do not enter, protected floodplain area, county enforcement active. They hammered them into the soil at 15-foot intervals, bright orange, and impossible to miss. And yet, the very next morning someone tore them down. I found 3 of them snapped in half, tossed in the creek bed. My no trespassing signs had been spray painted over in red, and someone had dumped a half-burned pile of trash where the fire pit used to be. I walked straight to the HOA office. It wasn't much, just a converted guest house near the community clubhouse, but it was where the board met and where I knew Lila spent most of her afternoons pretending to be the mayor of Stonebrook. When I walked in, she was sitting behind a cheap wood desk, flipping through printed versions of the Sentinel article. Mr. Garrison, she said, not looking up. I know you're behind the vandalism, I said. I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to. The signs, the creek, my fence, all of it. She folded the paper slowly. You've embarrassed this community. I protected it, I said. You built on a floodplain, endangered children, and lied to your neighbors. Do you think anyone will care 6 months from now, she snapped. Once the camp is rebuilt properly, this will all fade. I leaned in. It won't be rebuilt, because I'm not going anywhere. And now that the county's involved, you're not either. Her face twitched just slightly, but enough. You're a bitter, lonely man, she said, voice low. That's what all of this is. A power trip. No, I replied. It's a warning. The land remembers what people forget. You'd do well to remember that. And with that, I walked out. The next day, it poured again. But this time, the creek stayed in its bed, flowing smooth and clean. The land was healing. But the real storm, the one brewing inside the HOA, was just beginning. After the signs were torn down, I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't confront Lila again. I didn't post in the Facebook group or send an angry letter to the HOA board. I did what I've done best my entire life. I went quiet. In the Army Corps of Engineers, we used to say, the river speaks loudest when no one listens. Well, I had listened to this land longer than anyone in Stonebrook had even lived here. So I pivoted. Instead of pushing harder against Lila and her cronies, I dug deeper into legal codes, environmental precedents, and past violations in other HOA communities across the state. What I found was staggering. There were at least 9 different infractions tied to the creek camp construction and building on protected riparian buffer without a permit, altering the grade of floodplain soil, destruction of native plant species, illegal redirection of stormwater, fire ring within 30 feet of flowing water, no fencing or safety railings near public access, use of community funds without transparent vote, false representation of boundary lines, unauthorized public events on private land. Every one of these came with its own trail of statutes, and every one could be traced back to a specific individual responsible, mostly Lila Carson. The key wasn't just to prove the violations. That part was done. The key was to make sure someone outside this community held her accountable. So I filed 2 additional reports, one with the State Environmental Review Commission, one with the County Ethics Oversight Board, citing the fraudulent map and possible misuse of HOA funds. These weren't flashy moves. No one noticed them. Lila was too busy staging her reconstruction rally, complete with balloons and a table offering HOA-branded water bottles, to realize I had turned the entire chessboard around her. Meanwhile, I reached out to 2 former colleagues, retired engineers, who now served as consultants for municipal infrastructure and environmental compliance. One of them, Vernon Cray, had decades of experience in urban watershed systems. When I sent him the photos and layout diagrams, he called me within the hour. Jesus, Ray, he said, this isn't just stupid, it's reckless. I know. They built perpendicular to the waterline, he said. Any surge will shear off the foundation. And that fill dirt, it's going to compress and sink within a year. Tops. Can you put that in writing? He did. A full technical report stamped with his certification, breaking down the instability of the structure and the downstream impact of obstruction. I added it to my growing dossier, now nearly 2 inches thick. Still, I said nothing. Let them dance. I watched them on the next sunny weekend hosting another gathering near the damaged platform. There weren't as many people now, word had spread. The press coverage had cooled and some families were starting to keep their distance. But Lila kept up appearances, smiling with forced warmth, walking the perimeter like a senator campaigning in denial. She avoided eye contact with me entirely. And then 2 moments changed everything. The first came in a brown envelope delivered to her office. A cease and desist order from the State Environmental Review Commission. The second came a day later, an email addressed to all HOA members, including me, even though I hadn't attended a meeting in 5 years. The subject line was, Emergency session called, HOA board vote required. The body read, due to ongoing legal action and formal investigations, the Stonebrook HOA board will hold an emergency session to discuss the future of the Creek Camp project and to vote on potential suspension of President Lila Carson's authority pending review. I smiled when I read it. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was a crack, the first one. I went to that meeting. Oh yes. After years of refusing to step inside that sterile clubhouse with its beige carpet and fluorescent lights, I walked in wearing a flannel shirt, jeans, and a weatherproof jacket. I wasn't there to gloat. I was there to observe. The room was tense. Maybe 30 residents in folding chairs. The rest of the board sat at the front like a panel of reluctant judges. Lila was pale, jaw tight, but still trying to hold court. We are facing coordinated attacks, she said, standing with her hands clasped. This is the result of one man's vendetta against community spirit. If we cave to bureaucrats, we surrender the very fabric of what makes Stonebrook strong. A few people nodded weakly, but many didn't. Some looked down, some looked straight at me. Then the board vice president, Martha Kemp, a woman I had barely spoken to in 10 years, cleared her throat. We have confirmed that the construction violated multiple county ordinances. The cease and desist is valid, and we have now received a formal complaint from the State Ethics Board regarding falsified boundary documents. You could have heard a pin drop. Martha looked at the other board members. We need to vote on immediate suspension of President Carson's authority until the investigation is complete. Lila snapped, "You can't do this." "We can," Martha said, voice calm but resolute. "And we will." The vote wasn't even close. 5-1 in favor of suspension. Lila stood still for a moment, then gathered her papers with shaking hands and stormed out. A few sympathetic members followed, but no one said anything. When she was gone, Martha looked at me. "Mr. Garrison," she said, addressing me formally, but with a new tone, "would you be willing to help us assess what's salvageable at the creek site? We'd like your expertise." I paused, not for effect, but because it hit me, I didn't want to punish the whole neighborhood. I wanted healing, safety, truth. So I nodded. "I'll help," I said. "But only if we restore the land to how it was, no shortcuts, no speeches. Just stewardship." She agreed, and with that, the room exhaled. It was the quietest victory of my life. But it wasn't about me. It was about the creek, and it was about what comes next. 3 days after the emergency vote, I was back at the creek, not as a lone homeowner fending off an overzealous HOA, but as a quiet guide to what the land needed next. The air felt different, lighter somehow. Maybe it was just me. Maybe it was the absence of Lila's presence, her towering certainty that only her vision could prevail. Martha Kemp met me at the property line that morning with a clipboard and a hesitant smile. She was different now. Less defensive, more curious. She wasn't trying to run anything. She was trying to understand. "Ray," she said, tucking a pen behind her ear, "the county scheduled a formal re-inspection today. They said you'd know the terrain better than anyone. Would you mind walking it with them?" "I'd be glad to," I replied. By noon, 3 county officials had arrived, this time from a different division. Structural safety, environmental preservation, and zoning. And trailing behind them, wearing a county badge clipped to his vest, was someone I hadn't seen in nearly a decade. "Ray Garrison," he called, grinning as he stepped onto the soft earth as I live and breathe. It was Marcus Valenti, former Army engineer, now working in municipal inspection services. "You're with the county now?" I asked, shaking his hand firmly. 5 years. Got tired of private contracting. Figured it was time to give back. He surveyed the site, already wincing at the waterlogged base of the tilted pavilion. "You weren't kidding," he said, squatting to test the wood with a screwdriver. It sank in with almost no resistance. The structure's got the lifespan of a paper bag in a thunderstorm. The rest of the team followed closely behind him as we moved along the creek's edge. I pointed out the collapsed root system, where they'd dug out native sedge grass, the backfilled trench that had redirected stormwater into the slope, and the exposed rebar still jutting out from where a child could have tripped. "This is the worst case I've seen in a residential zone," said one of the environmental officers. "No soil survey, no permits, no runoff mitigation. And they funneled foot traffic through a live floodplain." I nodded. "And they did it with kids. They took measurements, photographs, and drone footage. One of them used a moisture sensor to show how the soil had compacted into near concrete, preventing absorption. Another took samples of the creek water and quietly noted that E. coli levels had likely spiked after the field day event, thanks to runoff from the open fire ring and food waste." Marcus shook his head. "The pavilion needs to come down. Yesterday." The team held a quick huddle beside the former fire pit, now a soggy crater of ash and broken brick. Then, just before they left, Marcus approached me with a document in hand. "We're issuing a public safety condemnation," he said. "This area is now legally declared unsafe. The HOA will be ordered to remove all structures and restore the buffer zone under county supervision. If they refuse, we'll bring in contractors and bill them directly." I took the paper, stared at the bold red stamp across the top. "Condemned. Hazard zone. Immediate action required." It was real, official, unshakable. Later that evening, I emailed a scanned copy of the order to every HOA member I could find, along with a detailed, respectful message. "Neighbors, I know this conflict has been loud, painful, and sometimes confusing, but I want you to understand that my goal has never been to fight against community spirit. It's been to protect this land from irreversible damage. The county's inspection today confirmed that the creek camp is not only illegal, but hazardous to public safety and environmental health. Restoration efforts will begin soon. I welcome volunteers who wish to learn more about how we can use this land respectfully and sustainably. This isn't the end of something. It's the beginning of a better way forward. Ray Garrison. I didn't expect much, but replies began trickling in. Dana wrote, "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I want to help." Edgar offered to teach a session on native plants. Even Teresa, who once signed a petition Lila had circulated against me, said, "I get it now. I really do." And just like that, the creek that had once isolated me was becoming a bridge. The next day, I saw something I hadn't seen in months. Kids sitting on the ground drawing pictures of frogs and birds. No plywood platforms, no megaphones or banners. Just quiet curiosity the way it should be. Then came the final insult to Lila's legacy, though it wasn't mine to deliver. The county posted a public bulletin online and mailed notices across the region. Stonebrook Creek Site declared public hazard zone. All construction deemed unlawful. HOA officers named in report may be subject to further investigation. Residents advised to avoid restricted area until rehabilitation efforts are complete. And they named her, right there in the fine print, lead authority of unpermitted project Lila Carson, former HOA president. I didn't cheer. I didn't share it on social media. I simply printed the notice and pinned it on the old oak near the creek just above where my bench used to sit. That night it rained again. Not hard. Just steady, but the creek flowed clean, clear, unobstructed. For the first time since this began, the land breathed easy. So did I. 2 days after the inspection, a county truck rolled into Stonebrook and parked beside the former pavilion site. Out stepped 2 workers in fluorescent vests with clipboards and a black and yellow caution sign the size of a doorway. One of them carried a small auger, the other a laser leveling rod. No speeches, no warning. Just the quiet, undeniable machinery of law doing its work. By noon, they had erected a tall metal-framed sign directly in front of what remained of the creek camp. In bold letters, it read, "Official notice, County of Westridge. Hazard zone. Protected riparian corridor. Unauthorized structures must be removed within 7 days. Trespassing is prohibited. Restoration will be enforced under County Code 78.1402. Responsible parties, Stonebrook HOA Board and Associates." Just like that, everything changed. The platform, once Lila Carson's monument to community pride, now looked like a deflated, forgotten prop in a condemned play. The wood sagged under its own weight. The fire ring was filled with stale water and mosquitoes. The only things that moved were windbirds and county officials with clipboards. But the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was confusion, then anger. At the next HOA meeting, which I attended more as witness than participant, residents packed the clubhouse to the walls. They weren't there to support Lila anymore. They were there demanding answers. "I voted for the camp because I thought it was legal," said one woman standing with her arms crossed. "You told us we had clearance. You said Ray was being difficult," added another man. Turns out he was the only one who knew what he was talking about. Martha Kemp sat at the front table with her head high and her voice calm. "We were misled," she said. "The board approved a budget without proper permits because we were assured by Lila that they weren't needed." That was false. There were murmurs, then a shout from the back. "So what happens now? Are we paying the fines?" "Yes," Martha said. "The HOA will cover the cost of removal, remediation, and penalties. And Lila Carson has been formally removed from all board-related activities pending further review." "She better be," someone muttered. But there was no more fight in the room. No more defending a camp built on arrogance and stolen soil. Outside, I stood beneath the oak tree, where the laminated declaration from the county now flapped softly in the wind. A boy of about 10 wandered by on a bike, stopped to look at the sign, and asked, "Mister, what happened here?" I crouched beside him. People forgot how important the land is. They thought they could do whatever they wanted with it. He frowned. "But it's just a creek." I smiled. "That's what makes it matter." Back at home, I received a call from Trent Walters. "Ray," he said, "we've approved the grant." "What grant?" "The Community Restoration Grant. You applied for it, remember? The one for floodplain rehabilitation. Your proposal went through. The county's offering funding and we'd like you to oversee the project. For a moment, I couldn't speak. You want me to lead the restoration? You're the reason we caught it in time. The land's still reclaimable. And frankly, no one knows it better than you do. I exhaled slowly. I accept. A week later, we began removing the pavilion. Not with bulldozers or drama, just neighbors, volunteers, and the steady hands of a few professionals. We carried away the planks, separated salvageable wood, and tore up the vinyl tarp. It was grueling muddy work, but no one complained. We found earthworms under where the benches used to be, signs of life returning. Kids came too. Dana's son helped replant sedgegrass. Edgar showed a group of teenagers how to test the water's pH. We hung new signs, not warnings, but invitations. Restoration in progress. Community healing together. That phrase stayed with me. Community healing. Because truth be told, I hadn't always liked Stonebrook. Not since the beginning. I moved here because I needed quiet, not connection. I didn't attend barbecues or decorate for holidays. I wasn't bitter, just tired. But this fight had done something unexpected. It had pulled people toward the truth. It had forced them to choose between appearance and substance, between power and humility. And maybe in its strange and messy way, it had also helped people finally see the creek not as a backdrop or a shortcut to summer fun, but as a living thread in the land they all shared. The final stage of this project involved removing the filled dirt and bringing in native plants to anchor the banks. The county sent saplings, river birch, dogwood, buttonbush. We planted each one with care. And as I tamped the soil around the last tree, a woman I'd never met came up beside me. You're Mr. Garrison, right? I nodded. I just wanted to say thank you. I was scared to speak up when all this started, but I'm glad someone did. I offered a quiet smile. It's not about being loud, it's about being right. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something ease inside me. The land was still wet with memory, but now it carried no weight of war, only the promise of growth. The creek flowed on. The final storm came just as summer began to yield to early fall, a long, soaking downpour that rolled in from the western ridge, low and heavy, like something ancient waking up. The sky turned to steel by midday. By 5 p.m., the rain was falling in sheets, slapping rooftops, flooding gutters, and turning the streets of Stonebrook into slow-moving rivers of runoff. I stood at the edge of my property, where the creek curled like a question mark through the newly planted buffer zone. The dogwoods we'd placed 3 weeks earlier held firm, their roots already knitting into the soil. The river birch saplings swayed but didn't bend. I could smell the storm, rich, metallic, and filled with memory. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel dread. The water came hard, then harder. By dusk, it had risen a full foot, swallowing the lower bank and licking at the place where the pavilion had once stood. But there was no surge, no collapse. The creek restored to its natural flow, absorbed and deflected the torrent just as it had for generations before anyone here had ever held a clipboard or drawn a property map. Across the hill, I saw them. HOA members, current and former, gathered in the parking lot of the clubhouse, some staring downhill in silence, some pacing with cell phones in hand. A few of them were pointing toward my property, toward the water, toward what they had nearly broken. Lila Carson was among them. She stood alone under a black umbrella, her posture stiff and miserable. The storm caught the hem of her expensive coat and plastered it to her legs. I could see her watching, eyes narrowed, mouth drawn tight. She wasn't speaking anymore. Not to anyone. Not after the ethics board had officially opened an investigation into her handling of funds, fraudulent documents, and what the report called deliberate environmental endangerment. They hadn't pressed charges yet, but her reputation was ruined. The woman who once wielded HOA authority like a sword now walked her dog in the dark, avoided eye contact at the grocery store, and canceled every appearance on community panels. It wasn't vengeance, it was consequence. As the storm peaked, a culvert near Willowbend Drive overflowed. Water cascaded down the slope like a temporary waterfall. The homeowners in that section, many of whom had supported the Creek Camp initiative, now scrambled to move trash bins, unblock drains, and keep water from lapping into garages. But down at the creek on my land, the water curved and flowed as designed. It didn't rage. It moved, purposefully, cleanly. It did its work without apology. Martha Kemp called me later that night. "Ray," she said breathlessly, "I just wanted to thank you again. If you hadn't intervened, I don't even want to think about what would have happened down there tonight." "Is everyone okay?" I asked. "A few close calls, but nothing like last year's overflow. The restoration worked. Everyone's saying so." "Good." She hesitated. "There's talk of naming the area." "Please don't," I said with a chuckle. "It's just a creek." "Exactly," she replied. "And you reminded us of that." We hung up. The next morning, the clouds cleared. The air smelled of pine and river silt. I walked the perimeter again, inspecting the banks. The mulch held. The saplings stood. Not a single board or nail remained from the failed structure that had once threatened everything. At the far end of the creek, a group of kids skipped stones laughing. One of them waved at me. I didn't recognize him, but I waved back. By the afternoon, the county issued its final report. Stonebrook Creek Stabilization Certified. After comprehensive review and site visits, we confirm the land has been returned to natural floodplain functionality. Further development is prohibited. Area is deemed stable and protected under Urban Watershed Code. Attached to the report was a simple note from Trent. "You did it, Ray. Took longer than it should have, but you were right. The creek remembers." I placed the letter in the folder with everything else. The photos, the reports, the old laminated maps now curling at the edges. Then I tucked the folder into the back of my filing cabinet beneath a folder marked Army Retirement and another labeled Dad's Letters. Some things don't need to be displayed, just remembered. I didn't throw a party. I didn't speak at the HOA's fall gathering, even though they invited me. I just kept walking the creek, checking the soil, waving at the kids, and planting wildflowers when the season allowed. Edgar and I started leading nature walks for local families. Dana organized monthly cleanup days. Maria Jenkins came back once to write a follow-up piece, this time with the headline, "Creek Restored Community Redeemed What One Man's Stand Against HOA Overreach Can Teach Us All." I read it once, smiled, and put it away. I wasn't a hero. I was just a man who remembered what it meant to listen to the land. A man who'd spent his life studying terrain water and the ways things fall apart when people ignore warning signs. But this time they hadn't. This time enough people looked and learned. The HOA still existed, trimmed down and cautious. Martha continued to serve as interim president, then stepped aside for a younger resident with more transparency in mind. The board meetings were smaller now, less shouting, more listening. One evening, near sunset, I returned to the creek with a thermos of coffee and sat where my old bench used to be. In its place now stood a simple flat stone left there by someone I hadn't seen place it. It had been inscribed by hand, bound to those who protect what can't speak. No name, no signature, just those words. I sat there as the sun sank behind the trees, the creek whispering beside me, and I realized something I hadn't in years. This wasn't just a victory over an HOA. This was restoration in every sense of the word. Fall settled in quietly, the way it always did here. The trees along the creek, Sweet Gum River birch and sycamore, began to bronze and rust at the edges, their leaves curling like old paper. The water flowed softer now, clearer than it had in years. After everything, after the noise, the letters, the threats, and the downpours, the creek was just itself again. And so was I. There was a rhythm to the days now. Mornings started with the same mug of coffee, but instead of tension in my chest, there was air, real full breath. I still walked the creek path before the sun crested the pines, checking for erosion, looking at how the young saplings were taking root. Most of them had survived the storms more resilient than I expected. Maybe in some ways so was I. One Saturday morning in late October, I spotted Dana, kneeling near the edge of the stream, planting blue flag iris bulbs with her son. She waved when she saw me. "We thought the water might like some color come spring," she said. "It will," I replied. "That's a good spot too, won't get flooded too easily." She looked up at me. "You ever think about leading something official, like a community program? The kids look up to you. So do a lot of the parents." I chuckled. "I don't know. I've spent most of my life avoiding crowds." "But you didn't avoid this one," she said softly, and then turned back to planting. That stuck with me. Later that week, I sat at my dining table, flipping through a faded leather notebook I hadn't touched in years. It held old engineering sketches, field notes from Afghanistan, and a single line I had once written after a failed levee project. "Build where water wants to go, and it will thank you. Build where it doesn't, and it will break you." I decided for once not to keep that knowledge to myself. By November, I began leading small creek walks on Sundays. Not formal tours, just conversations. I'd point out native species, explain how bank roots, slow erosion show kids how to spot frog eggs under smooth stones. The parents listened too. It wasn't just the science they were learning, respect, humility. That you didn't have to control something to love it. We didn't need the HOA to approve it. They had taken a back seat, and frankly, most of the neighborhood seemed glad. The new president, a soft-spoken woman named Elise, made it her policy to ask before doing. She attended every cleanup event. She asked questions, took notes, and listened when someone like Edgar offered a correction. And Lila Carson, she sold her home by December. No public goodbye, no farewell party. Just a moving truck on a cold Thursday morning and the silence of departure. Her name was never mentioned at HOA meetings again. She became what the land needed her to be gone. In her absence, something rare happened. The neighborhood healed. People waved more. Kids played along the creek again. But this time they stayed on the trail, followed the signs, asked questions. Someone had built a little wooden box beside the main entrance path with a sign that read, "Borrow a nature guide. Return when you're done." Inside were laminated pages about local birds, amphibians, and plant life. No one knew who had started it. Maybe Edgar, maybe Dana. Maybe the land itself inspired it. The creek had returned to the community not as a project, but as a presence. It had demanded respect and been given it eventually stubbornly through resistance and consequence. And in doing so, it had given something back. Connection. In December, the county invited me to a small recognition ceremony. I almost didn't go, but Maria Jenkins reached out and told me she'd be covering it. She wanted a follow-up photo. Not a posed shot, just me standing by the creek I'd fought for. I stood awkwardly near a banner that read, "Community Environmental Partner of the Year, Ray Garrison." Someone handed me a plaque. Maria smiled as she took the photo and whispered, "You look more like part of the creek than the ceremony." I laughed. That's the point. She published the article the next day with the headline, "The Quiet Man Who Stood Between a Creek and Its Collapse." I clipped the piece, folded it neatly, and tucked it into the leather notebook beside my old sketches. I didn't frame it. That kind of victory doesn't hang on walls. It grows quietly in the soil. Winter came. Snow dusted the pines. The creek moved slower but never froze. It had too much to say even in the cold. And on Christmas morning, I stood on the old trail alone but not lonely, watching as a group of deer picked their way across the opposite bank. There was no fence, no pavilion, no fire pits, just soft earth, moving water, and the sound of a place remembering how to be wild. For years, I thought retirement would mean disappearing, that the best I could do was keep to myself, avoid interference, and let the world move on. But the creek taught me differently. It taught me that stillness is not silence, that protecting something doesn't always mean standing in front of it. Sometimes it means standing behind it, making sure it's never touched the wrong way again. And when I think of that laminated county sign nailed to the oak still there months later, I don't see it as a warning anymore. I see it as a vow, a quiet promise between land and man, that if we listen, really listen, we don't have to fight nature. We just have to walk beside it. That's what I'll keep doing, as long as the creek flows.